On this episode, I'm going to be giving you my fastest tips for starting out with a podcast, where to begin, and how to implement this and execute this strategy. Tune in. This is a 5-minute banger. Let's go. This is the Podcast in the Rough. Tune in every Friday for new adventurous episodes. Welcome back to the Podcast in the Rough. I'm your host, Zebulon Thomas, and this is a 5-minute speed run. I want to help you in the fastest, most quickest way possible. So we're going to dive right in. Listen, when you're building out a podcast, some of you inside my group have not yet started a podcast. I want to help you get over the hump. So here's the first place I would start if I was starting from scratch. This is where you begin. The first thing you want to do is sit down and think about, what do you want your podcast to be about? Like, what is the topics going to be about? What are you going to talk about? For me, I sat down, I was like, I wanted to share my life story. I wanted to share some of the stuff I've done. I published books, and I wanted to go at it with an entrepreneur point of view. And so for me, I thought the best strategy would be to call my podcast my own name. And that wasn't really a good idea, because it took so long to grow the podcast and it was so hard to get it out there, and it didn't show up in search engines as much. Then I switched my strategy and said, okay, I want to talk about what I've done for all these companies. And I was like, well, let's call it the Think Like a Strategist podcast. Well, that was just me thinking off the top of my head, and it wasn't effective either, because in the end, I kind of limited myself, and it wasn't my niche. I helped all these people grow their businesses, and I gave them strategies because I was a strategist. But at my core, I wasn't enjoying that, and it wasn't optimized in the search to be found. It was very hard to grow that. So then I quickly ended that. I said, we're going to start over. And I rebooted. The new podcast came down to me thinking about, what do I want my podcast to be about? What do I want my listeners and my viewers to experience when they're listening to my podcast? And that was, I wanted to take them on an adventure. And I didn't want to lock me into just one niche of podcasting, of topics. And so I said, you know what? I want it to be called, the Podcast in the Rough. And it was something I said early on in season 2 in my intro. I had already said that. If you go back and listen, this is the Podcast in the Rough. Welcome to the Zebulon Thomas podcast. But I was talking about this diamond in the rough, this gem, this podcast hidden amongst all the craziness and the dirt and the sand and the grind. And I pull it out and I go, look it, there's some value here. Check this out. It's right up under it. You got to dig for treasure. So what I did is I said, the Podcast in the Rough. And then I ran that in my list of names. So make a list. I made like 30 names of what I want my podcast to be about. And then I looked at those names and I said, this might not work. This might work. Then I chunked that down to like top 10. And I said, well, these 10 are ones that I'm really excited about. It feels good. And now I need to take those 10 and I want to check how they rank on the SEO in a search engine. So I went over to a website. And what I did is I ran these all through the generator, and it would search out on the internet what it ranked. You want your podcast to rank high in the SEO. You want this to be above 50%. Right? So when I started searching this, that took off like at least 7 of the options, because they were all ranking under 50% for me. So what was nice is it came down to this top 3. And so I put in the Podcast in the Rough, and it ranked at a 98% in the search. And it was a no-brainer. I was like, that is it. I can't tell you why it ranks that way. I just know that it ranks, meaning it's going to be searchable, it's going to be pushed on Google, it's going to be easy to find, and it's going to help me grow much easier because I have the name optimized as best as I can for the search engines, for the SEO, for the analytics, for the data on the internet. Take time, write down a list of all the names that you want your podcast to be called. And these names should reflect a little bit about what it is that you want to talk about and those topics, and give yourself some headroom to be able to grow this podcast. Right now, I'm talking about the Podcast in the Rough, podcasting from start to success. It's all about podcasting, but I'm not stuck there, because as this season goes on, season 4 is going to be a little bit different, but it could still be the Podcast in the Rough. I can now have guests on. I could talk about things. I can grow this into different businesses. It's not limiting me in any way. And the Podcast in the Rough actually tells you what this is about. You're going to go on an adventure. It's all the information that's in the grind and the dirt. We're going to dig for buried treasure. Inside that, we're going to find clues. We're going to find artifacts. We're going to find value. We're going to find things that are really going to make life exciting. So it's a journey, and that's what it's about. So write down what you want, put it in the search engine, find it, make sure it's above 50% on the SEO rank, and you'll be good to go. Start there. All right, thank you so much. This has been a power run. I did it. 5 minutes, let's go. Disregard the intro and outro, okay? Because that added time to it. All right, there's my 5-minute run. Thank you. is the podcast in the rough.